Welcome to the Canadian Wealth Secrets podcast, Diane. We are super excited to have you here. Folks may quickly recognize that someone else that's usually here, John, is not here with us today, sadly. But that just means I get to ask you all of my questions, and I don't have to sit waiting back for John's questions that I'm not interested in learning about. So it's going to be all about learning for me, and we're going to be digging into some of the great ideas that you have to share here with the wealth secret seekers out there. Diane, welcome to the show. Give the audience just a little snippet into your world. Who is Diane Nelson? Where are you coming to us from? And what are you focusing on these days in this world?
Okay, well, you're asked all kinds of things in that, but thank you for inviting me, Kyle. That's wonderful. And that you and I met not too long ago and exchanged some great ideas, and we felt like we had some energy behind our thoughts. So, very briefly, I'm a coach, trainer, consultant. I have worked in the not-for-profit sector for many, many years. I'm currently stationed, shall I call it, in Waterloo, Ontario. But I like to describe myself as somebody with no fixed address because I
Hmm.
live full time in an RV. And so
Ooh.
my life path or my yearly path is 10 months in Waterloo, 2 months traveling about, typically as a house sitter. So I sit pets for other people as they travel, and I get to feel what it's like to live in their shoes for a while.
I love it. I love it. That's such an awesome picture. And I think it almost, gives us a little bit of a glimpse into some of what we're going to be talking about, which really comes down to this big thing in our head called our brain, our minds, and really getting into trying to, I think, understand what's going on up there. One thing that really, made me think about why you could be a good fit for our audience was as business owners, as entrepreneurs, as investors, we are doing a lot of, we'll call it like work on our own, like we're doing a lot of things. We have to do a lot of decision making on our own. Myself, I'm lucky. I have some business partners that I work very closely with. And I'll be honest and say, for those solopreneurs that are out there, you have basically you and your brain to work with, you and your mind to work with. Maybe you're lucky enough to have maybe a spouse or a partner that you can bounce ideas off of, or maybe some sort of mentorship group. But the reality is that it can be very difficult when we're making tough decisions in the world of business and investing in order to actually take action, or maybe hold back from taking action in certain respects. And the piece that pops into my mind when I think about the work you do in mentorship and coaching and counseling, maybe we can even talk a little bit about that, some of those differences, is that you help people kind of work through what do they really want. So I'm wondering, can you kind of set the stage for us a little bit here today? What would you say that you're helping most of your clients with when they come to you and seek some of your assistance in terms of their own personal or business world?
Okay. So let me just add on to the examples you used with the solo entrepreneurship or, small business owners and founders. I primarily, not exclusive, but primarily work with leaders of teams. So they are in organizations, so they're not entrepreneurial per se. But the common path is that leaders are often very much on their own. They have to be very they have to deal with their own stuff, support their team, as well as then respond to and support senior leadership. So it can also be a very lonely place, being that mid-level leader. So there's a lot of commonality with who I connect with and who you connect with. And so on that piece about the loneliness or being alone is we are with our own thoughts all of the time. And typically, I think people don't recognize how much input our mind is giving us and the input that isn't always very productive.
Mm.
So, later on, I'll talk a little bit more about my path and how I came to it. But essentially, the kind of the Oh, by the way, I attempted to come up with a math formula. Now, you might tell me it's not math, but it's kind of a formula. So it's what happens in our mind is we have a thought. Thoughts bubble up all the time. So a thought, and then it attaches to emotion. So we have an emotion about that thought, whether we feel good about it or stressed about it or angry about it. And then, so thought plus the emotion then gets translated out through energy as a feeling. So positive or negative feeling. And then that impacts how we show up with people, what our personal reality, our personality, and how we impact others through connecting, through conversation with others. So the thought and emotion travel very quickly and have impact on everybody around us
Mm.
very quickly. And if we're not aware of that thought, beginning thought, it can run amok so fast. And awareness is sounds like a simple concept, but it's harder than you think to get a hold of.
I bet. It's interesting because I always like to say it's, the voice in your mind is always giving you bad advice, right? And always is the wrong word. It's not always, but it's quite often, where it's making you doubt, it's making you think differently. But also what I'm hearing from you is this idea of noticing and naming the thought you have prior to it sort of being attached to that emotion is probably a really important skill to be developing. And I'm sure it takes time, like anything, right? Where it's like, wait a second, some people might be listening and saying, does that really happen with me? But in reality, it really does, right? You have this thought, and then it immediately, sometimes it's a good thought. And when we say good thought, that means I felt good when I thought about it, right? There's that emotion.
Mhm.
And it's probably, a bit of both. Like if we feel too positively or too much positivity about an emotion, maybe it might influence me to do something in a way. Or if I feel maybe negatively about it, that might also impact sort of how I come and sort of interact with the outside world. So I'm wondering how would you say that leaders and again, entrepreneurs being sort of, again, a solopreneur, but you're leading this ship. Maybe it's less people, but you are being a leader, and you're sort of making me recognize it's like, even if you're in a large organization, you're leading. And I might argue that now you almost have this additional pressure on yourself. You feel like eyes are on you because you're supposed to be in charge, you're supposed to be a leader.
Mhm.
What are some of the common maybe struggles that some of the clients, the leaders that you're working with, are actually facing in terms of doing this process, noticing and naming those thoughts and sort of doing something more positively about it?
Okay. So, uh, and it's not just people that I work with. I would say it is all of humanity. And that thought, just to backtrack a little bit on what you said, from the moment you wake up and pretty quickly you'll have a thought. And if you start noticing what that thought is, and then deciding what emotion you want to put to it, that's called self-command. And
Mm,
that's what I do with clients is help people get right at the beginning of their day or at any interaction thereafter, any interaction of what is the thought and to make sure to decide and choose upon the emotion. If you don't choose and be selecting what is going to be best for the situation, what's going to be best for you, then our default patterns kick in. And we all have default patterns. And in fact, it's been analyzed through many, many assessments that there are 9 voices. I'll just give a few of them, and they're described kind of like a profile version of a trait, but I think you'll recognize them. And entrepreneurs, most entrepreneurs have this first one: hyperachiever. Hyperachievers, they want the next thing, and as soon as they get that next thing, it dulls in comparison by what else they want.
mm,
So it's a constant striving and going for more and more and more. Some other examples are a restless nature. Sometimes entrepreneurs have the restless nature. They see the shiny object, and, oh, I'm going to go that direction. And then they get there, or they start to get there, and maybe something else comes up and they go another direction. Um, there's a hyper rational, someone who, and you might find more of this in your field, the person, the default pattern that has, well, what are the facts and figures? Just give me the facts and figures, the decision will be clear, without any recognition of the emotional side or human interaction side that might be important in making a decision. Controller, also very common among financial people, is needing to control outcomes, and there has to be a particular way and be in charge of that, because if they let go of control, things would run amok. And so there's a need to control. Or stickler, to have things done in a particular order, particular manner. So these are just a few examples. There are 9 in total, and
I love it.
these are patterns. Now, as I say them, and I was probably describing them in a way that people might wonder, well, are those good things or bad things? Because hyperachiever sounds pretty positive.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like anything, any strength. It is a strength until it gets overused or used in the wrong way
Mm-hmm.
or to the exclusion of other things. So a funny example might be is, hammers are great when you have nails, but they're pretty useless if you have a screw,
Mm-hmm.
or pretty useless if you're trying to paint a landscape. It is a strength. So it's the trick, or the process is to recognize when you're using these default patterns, thought patterns, as strengths, and when they tip over and they're not a strength
Mm-hmm.
anymore. So that's where it takes some self-awareness. And if I use myself as an example, as I do in almost all of my work, this is when I first kind of went down this path to understanding these voices. I was quite critical. I said, no, that's not me. That's not me. Because there's an assessment you can take, and it's, a 10-minute assessment, and it spits out this idea of what are your top voices, your uh, habits of thought, I like to describe them. And I agreed with the hyper achiever, but I didn't really agree with anything else. And then over time, I started to recognize, oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, that's me. Oh, yeah, I see how that gets me into
Yeah.
trouble. So then it's like shining a light into the brain, into myself. And, I've spent a career in counseling and helping people. I do this for a living. And still, this was a big eye opener to me. And now that I see those patterns, now I can do something about them. When you don't know they're there, you can't do anything about them.
Mm.
It's when you recognize, now you can really bite in and redirect and take control of the emotion that you want to attach to the thought, or whether you choose the thought at all. Our brain does come up with all kinds of thoughts, but unfortunately, it really is quite a habit creator. The
Mm.
brain does a lot of habit stuff because that's the most economical use of the resource. Your brain uses 20% of your energy. So if it recognizes any kind of pattern, if you wake up in the morning and you start being concerned about the weather and how you're going to maneuver the drive to work, then it's going to give you that every single day, and that just takes up space in your brain for nothing, right?
That this is really fascinating. And there's so many connections hearing you speak, and I haven't heard it described as you have. So I really appreciate it, even if it's selfishly so. I'm picturing some listeners are also either, if they've done some reading, you talked about this idea of habits and that quick thinking part of our brain, those two systems. It's like that quick thinking part of the brain wants to run with it, like
Yep.
it's like, I want to just take what's easy and I'm just going to take you to the promised land. And that's, the connection I'm making to these habits of thought that we tend to have. And the reality is like, we can look at it a couple of different ways. Like one way, if we want to be, essentially the ignorant approach, right? And not saying that rudely, but the way to go, hey, listen, I got this far and, my habits of thought have got me here. That's fine. But
Yes.
the reality is, I think it is, if we ever feel or have felt that things haven't worked out the way we wanted them to, when it comes to how we're feeling, how we're thinking, then it's probably a worthwhile exercise. And maybe some people have gone through with habits of thought that have sort of managed to serve them fairly well. But again, probably not perfectly, right? So there's like always opportunities for improvement. And then I can't help but think about some folks who have, developed habits of thought, be it through experience, be it through, whatever, like anything, trauma, like there's all kinds of things that could happen that probably, kind of etch these habits into your mind. And whether you're sort of, hey, I'm lucky I made it to here and I'm doing okay, or whether you are maybe not on a great path and you feel like I'm not feeling positive much of the time, or I'm not feeling at least calm and neutral, I'm always feeling something. I feel like this work could certainly be helpful for us to start recognizing whether it's uncomfortable or not, because I'm going to guess that most people, when they think of these 9 voices, I know you've only highlighted some of those. Most people are probably going to really like the ones that sound positive out of the box, but then maybe don't want to do the thinking required to go like, okay, at what point does it actually become more of a hindrance in certain situations than a help? So where would you begin? Like, let's pretend I'm the leader you're working with. What sort of, I guess, activities would we do to try to identify? Is it something that you can notice and name because you're so well versed in it? Or is it something that only the individual sort of needs to kind of work through, and really think through? I'm always very curious about that.
Okay, well, let me just go back a little bit, or draw a picture. I like talking in pictures, and I think this applies. Truly, I think this applies to everybody. I'd be happy to hear the exceptions to this, but I think everybody, when they're quiet and alone with themselves, can recognize that no matter what success they've experienced, they would like a little bit more, or they
Mm,
would like it in other capacities. I think it's our human journey to always be um, finding, getting a little more clarity, rubbing the fog off the mirror just a little bit more. So the image I've used for myself, and therefore for my business and how I connect with people, is that, like, my particular path was, when I started my career, it was a fairly quick spiral up, learning and advancing. And as time goes by, that circle gets a little wider, but it's still going upward, upward in the sense of I'm learning. And now that maybe it's not so much of a straight, tight line, but more of a bigger circle. So it's a broader learning, and exploring in different paths and things that are new, and new ideas. It one time in my life, I thought, I think I know everything I need to know to do the work I'm doing. And then boom, something new came in, and I went,
mhm.
"Oh, there's a whole new sector I didn't know anything about. Great, so much more." So
That's
work
like
now.
wisdom, like true
Yeah,
wisdom when
yeah.
when you start to recognize that,
There's
there's more to this, whatever the topic
right.
is, than I thought.
Yes, yes. And now let me attach the other part of what I do, and is so critical for leaders, critical for anybody who interacts with humans, therefore the earth, is while we have these thoughts and patterns of behavior that can be routinized, can be strengths, can be weaknesses, that stuff, that energy that goes on in the mind, gets radiates out. So from a business owner, it's how we connect with people, be it customers, be it our own team, be it with suppliers, or whomever. What's going on in the mind pattern is going to impact other people. So getting a hold of that, getting to a real crystal clear understanding of what the pattern is, and then choosing the preferred pattern, choosing the preferred way, and then making sure that communication with whomever, customers, suppliers, colleagues, that it lands in the way that you want. It let because the common thing for communicators is we tend to think people understand the way we're meaning. So we say something, we get a point across, and I'm assuming you understand exactly what I'm saying. Ha! You're probably not, because you're processing the words I use, the way I'm describing it based on your own experiences, and they are different. You are different than me. So, in order to make sure that the communication is really clear, I would need to stop and ask you some questions. How did you understand what I just said? Give me an example so that I know that you're on the same, on the same path as I'm saying. So, this is what happens for leaders. We make assumptions because we get in a hurry, because we need to move on sometimes. We need to just go fast, and we miss the questioning and clarifying. Are we truly on the same page? Are we truly saying, are you receiving it the way I'm meaning it to be understood? That's the work primarily that I do with leaders.
It's so fascinating because what I'm hearing you say, and I'm sort of reflecting on just this past week even. And I like to think that I've done a lot of work in trying to become a better listener. So to try to understand what someone's saying or what they might be meaning. But the part that is really interesting is that while I've done a lot of work there, of course, no one is ever an expert, right? You continue to build and refine these skills. The area I don't think I've spent enough attention on, or maybe any attention on, is actually thinking of my own thoughts and trying to understand what do I mean, right? And I think we've all been there. And I actually had a conversation this week with a partner, and it was almost like I couldn't. What I came to realize is that they weren't understanding what I was saying because actually I didn't understand what I wanted to say yet either. And I've got to assume that some of this, of course, like communication's the way it comes out. But if I haven't processed the thoughts and how it's making me feel and how, all of those things, I'm sure that that has to have some sort of influence on, again, how I'm speaking to others, how I'm expressing my feelings instead of my thoughts, right? And maybe I don't know if you can speak to that. It's like when your feelings come out of your mouth instead of your true thoughts coming out of your mouth. When we talk about what you're really wanting, instead you're talking about how it made you feel instead. I don't know if I'm on a random tangent there, but it
Well,
certainly jumped out at me anyway.
perhaps what I'm hearing is an extroversion trait. So an extrovert tends to process thoughts out loud. So
Mm,
if I just take the extremes, okay, most of us fall somewhere in the middle between extrovert and introvert, but I fall on the introvert side. So I'm figuring out what I want to say before I say it. Extroverts start speaking, and by the end of their sentence, they kind of figured out what they wanted to say. So it's something the way you described, maybe it's okay. That's the way you're wired. It's
yep.
okay. But maybe a bit of a forewarning to people who are listening is give me a minute while I work all this out. I'll get to my point and I'll find out if I agree with my own point when I get to the end of this.
I love that. Because
Yeah.
that you just painted a clear picture of the thought I was having earlier this week is exactly that. It was like by the end of the conversation, I was now clear. And I sort of wish I could go, you know what? Can we like just hit cut on that, that whole session we just had? And can I just
Because
start it over?
yeah,
And then meanwhile, John is more of an introvert, our co-host.
there you go.
John is very, he thinks things through and so you just nailed me right there. So
Yeah.
how does that does that change when it comes to how we can do some of the work that you're describing here? Like, is there something that, say, an extrovert, someone who's more on the extrovert side of the spectrum, like myself, to work that through prior? Is it just closing the door in a room by myself and talking it out at the mirror? Or like, is there something else I could be doing to help myself, get better at this skill?
Well, the thing with the extrovert and introversion, that we're rather hardwired. There are the five big personality traits. This is one of them. We're kind of hardwired. I wouldn't put a lot of energy in trying to become an introvert. Yeah, it wouldn't be worth the
Oh, for
effort.
you, I haven't wasted my time then because I
No.
haven't put any thought into it. But I
And
was
thank
like, maybe I should be. I'm not sure.
no, and thank goodness we're not all. Thank goodness we're not all introverts. Thank
Mhm.
goodness we're not all extroverts. That's amen to that. But it's the awareness. It's now so between you and John, so that would be like a team exercise I might work with you on, is that you recognize that that's how you are, and helping John to understand that he just needs to be patient while you work that through. Because for introverts, we tend to think, "Oh my God, when is he going to stop talking?"
He'd be laughing if he was here right now because he has to deal with that every day.
So, what I've learned being an introvert is now it doesn't bother it doesn't irritate me when people are doing that. I appreciate now that they're just going to take their time working it through, and I will be patient and wait. And then when you get to the end, then I can start asking questions to kind of narrow it in. And that's okay. Now, for an extrovert, you get frustrated with the silence
Mm-hmm.
or the okay, what is your opinion? Like, out with it, please. Whereas, we tend to take more time processing to come up with that. But when we do, it's there. So it's just a difference, just recognizing the difference. And that's the thing with communication between people is that you have these kinds of conversations, particularly if you're partners or if you're a team leader and team member, understanding that that's what it is and being aware of it.
Mm. Now,
Now there's
can
something, yeah, okay, go ahead.
me and maybe this will trigger that next thought that you had there. So what I at least in this moment am sort of taking from that, and of course I'll need more time to talk it out before I really know, but my thought is that this idea of noticing and naming your thoughts, regardless of whether you're introvert, extrovert, whether you're somewhere in the middle, like that part actually isn't really impacting this work that you're describing, right? And that you have to sort of be able to notice and name those thoughts so that you could then decide which sort of emotion you attach, if any, to those thoughts. So if John is sitting there waiting for me to be done rambling in his mind, he's probably thinking through his thoughts, going, okay, here's what I think is happening. And how am I going to handle that? That's going to be probably, as he strengthens that skill, he'll be able to then have a better response at the end to work from where I leave it off after rambling or whatever it might be.
It's all good rambling. Don't name yourself as being that it's a bad way. It's a perfectly healthy, normal way. Just recognize that that's just it's your delivery system. It's
Mhm.
your thought delivery system. But you're right. The thought patterns are the thing that happens before that you
Mhm.
want to understand and know because it's how you're driven. Are you driven um, to a negative side versus a positive side, and what style? I just want to comment. We are zigzagging a wee bit, but comment about the other thing that is so common when we are in communication with others. So we tend we tend not to be comfortable with silence, and as a result, we are all of us, I would say, are forming our response before the other person has finished speaking. Now that's a common thing. I think it's because we're uncomfortable with silence. Now, introverts slightly less uncomfortable with silence, but still we are. So the idea is that when you're in communication with a client, a customer, a potential, is to allow them, of course, Allow them to finish their thought before you form any kind of response. That's the trick. Now, I was just doing a webinar earlier this week, and I call this my my 3-step process: mindset, getting mindset clear, then the skill set, and then match set. So we talked a little bit about mindset, and I'd be happy to dig into those thought patterns more if you want. But the skill set is to ask questions, listen without any anticipation of what the answer is, without forming any kind of opinion, and ask more questions. Then reflect or reframe what they've said to make sure that you're understanding what they've said. So you paraphrase it back. Is this what you're saying? Is this what am I understanding this correctly? So the process of listening is really a back and forth in asking questions before making any kind of statements or any kind of providing your opinion. And that's the part that we shorten. Most of us just shorten that. And I asked people on this webinar, I said, when was the last time that you had a conversation where you felt heard, understood, and appreciated for your ideas? And of course, there was silence because it's not very common. Typically, if you stop and listen to conversations you're in, it's a lot of two monologues. Somebody says this, then the person says, "Well, this is what it is like for me." Well, that's my experience, and this is how this. It's two monologues as opposed to somebody responding with, "Tell me more about what you mean by that. Tell me, help me understand how you, when you said that feeling, what did that feel like for you?" Or what was your thought about that? Or how did you come up with that? Any kind of question to dig deeper for a fuller understanding. That's how you get true connection with people as to how, when they feel that you listen, understood, and appreciated. Doesn't mean you agree, doesn't
Mm-hmm.
mean you have complete synergy and understanding, but that you've heard to the end.
That is, I was trying to practice that as you were speaking, and I noticed,
Yeah.
especially in this sort of environment where sort of interviewing a guest,
Yeah.
where you tend to be trying to think of the next question.
Oh, yeah.
But then,
Oh,
I mean, that obviously could potentially hinder the interview because now you may be going off on a sort of a different tangent when there was a much better question that could have been formed from what you had shared. And I want to go.
it's very tricky in an interview style. Yes.
Sure,
If
sure.
we
But
were
but I
if
mean, it's becoming very clear to me in this moment about those three ideas. So I want to make sure that I understood. So here, I'm going to practice a little bit. I want to
Okay.
paraphrase back what I heard to you because I think the three, these three sets, I'll call them, is really, really helpful. So you had talked about the mindset, so we're talking about, again, that
That
clarity
that
mindset.
conversation. Yeah.
Yes, making
Mhm.
sure that that is in line. And that is a lot of work, in and of itself that we need to continue working through. The skill set piece was the asking of questions, listening without forming any sort of opinion until the speaker is finished. And then the part that I want to just make sure that I'm clear on is that when you talked about the paraphrasing back, is that the match set portion? So you're just making sure that what I think I heard matches what you're saying, and then would that just be iterative, I suppose, where you kind of head back through the loop as you gain more depth, or is it more of a asking more questions, making sure it matches, asking more questions? What does that look like, I
Okay.
suppose, in practice?
So I haven't gotten to the match set yet. So
Got
the
it.
paraphrasing back is still the 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 part of the conversation where you're being sure that you're really connecting and understanding.
Awesome.
The match set particularly comes, again, I was going to use my examples around leaders and team members, but it also applies to a salesperson and their a prospect, to a potential client or an ongoing client for that matter is, okay, now that I fully understand your situation and I've confirmed with you that I've understood your situation, the match set is now where you express your perspective, your understanding, and now that both people have been able to express now what are we going to do? What's the plan going forward? If it's a leader and team member, perhaps it's what's your next steps around this project? What's going to happen and when's it going to happen? What's the qualitative and quantitative expectations? So a clear steps forward. The reason why this is really important for leaders to appreciate is that I think leaders get a bit um, frustrated with it, that they have to spend this time in conversation. They want to be sure that there's going to be action taken in an agreed upon method. So that's the match set part. Now, if I talk about it in terms of customers, so I can imagine, you're meeting with people, making financial plans with them. You really need to understand what their objectives and desires are for their life. You've got to hear it all out, but then you've got some things to share. And that might adjust their pattern, or might be a short-term plan or a long-term plan. So then you have to get to the point of taking what you've learned from them, taking what you're able to give, and making a plan that you both agree that we're going to review and confirm that this is the direction we're going. For as long as that plan makes sense, adjusting along the way, but the match set is that you both leave the conversation with knowing what's coming next and
I
when.
love that. I love that. There's so, in business and, I think the larger the organization, the more, the clarity sort of, disappears, right? Where people are, sometimes there's random goals set, maybe we think there's clarity around what that goal might mean, or maybe the goal is too large. And it's like, what are the intermediary goals that we're going to need to actually achieve in order to get us closer? So this idea, and I can imagine that if you're working in a space, be it, again, like you had said, someone with a client, individual client, to ensure that, hey, we're both heading in the same direction, and I hear what your needs are, what your dream outcome is, and I now believe that I truly understand what that is because I've gone through and made sure to, ask those questions, listen, paraphrase, and then now we can kind of together decide on, hey, these are these next steps, do they make sense? Then you look at the, larger organizations and you think about people working within an organization, you have to, I'm sure there's lots of statistics around people wanting ownership, right? They want ownership of the work they're doing. And I have to assume that if we're engaging in this process, more so with different employees, different levels of employees, that we're going to get better results, even though it might feel maybe harder, or maybe it takes more time and effort, but the payoff feels like it's probably much more significant as well in the long run.
Yeah. There's I think a parallel to safety practices. It does cost money for companies to make sure that their safety practices are in place. But if they don't do them, the cost of an accident is far more.
Mm.
I think it's pretty similar to a leader spending some time upfront with each of their team members to take extra time in clarifying and making sure that they understand each other when they speak and describe things, so that those steps towards action and completing projects goes faster. Because if you go weeks thinking that you've been clear, thinking that there's been an agreement, and you find 2 weeks later that it's gone off the track somewhere, well, now you've wasted 2 weeks as opposed to
Mm.
wasting a half hour. Spend the time
That's
up front to save the time going forward.
it's a, and going back to mindset, like having a mindset that this work is important work is obviously key, right? For someone to be able to go, okay, it is worth the investment. because of what will come from it. And sometimes I think that immediate, gratification that we all seem to enjoy can be really tough, right? So you think about the hard work we need to put in.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, because I want to be respectful of your time here today. And I feel like there's so many more questions I have, but one thing I would want to know if I'm a listener right now, I'm now clearly, I think if I'm listening to this podcast, I'm going, okay, this is important work to be done. What would you say is sort of like a good first step for someone who's listening who maybe they knew that there's work to be done around mindset and around their thinking, right? I think a lot of people they're aware that this is important, but may not have done anything intentional about it. Do you have any sort of, we'll say starting points that you might point people to so they can begin this journey, which I'm going to guess is a lifelong journey, right? It's never going to be done and fixed. We need to be aware of it and we need to keep growing it. So where might one start? Is there something easy that they can do, or I'm going to say simple, because nothing is easy, but simple, that they might be able to maybe build into a routine or something that they can do to help them take that first step down this path?
I'm going to comment about the first assumption that you've made, that people tend to know that they need to do some work in this area. I find that they don't.
Mm.
Here, leaders. Here's a few examples. So leaders often get promoted because they're really good at the work that they do. They're they have engineering skills, they have project management skills, they have production skills, they have design skills. They're really good at. They get promoted to leader, and there's a parallel with entrepreneurs as well. But let me just finish this first example. So they get promoted to leader, and they're feeling initially quite confident. Yeah, my skills were recognized. But leading people is all about understanding oneself. It's not the skill anymore. They no longer have to do that work. They have to support people to do that work. And that's the people connection. So getting one's abilities to connect with people is the work. Similarly with entrepreneurs, I worked with a business owner who kept saying, why do they've hired a staff person and said, why don't they think like me? Well, for one, as an entrepreneur, you wouldn't want your staff to think like you. Otherwise, they'd go off and form their own company.
Exactly. Yeah.
But as the owner, entrepreneur, you have to be able to develop people to that stage. Okay, so the basis is first agreeing or accepting that you've got some work to do in terms of how to deal with people, how to motivate and bring people along to where you need them to be to work well. So the beginning step, I would say, is being open to some self-awareness. Now, the advantage, there's a free assessment online. I'd be happy to share that through your however you ex- uh, sorry, however you get this message out. There's a simple free assessment, and it's just mind-blowing. At least that's how I found it, was, oh, to recognize those thought patterns. And then from there, then you can investigate a little bit more. But that initial awareness piece, that's what will kick off a whole many steps of learning. So
Amazing.
start with awareness, and an assessment's a great way to kind of trigger you into a new field of thinking.
I will definitely be asking you for the link to that assessment. We'll put it up on the show notes page of the website so folks can visit canadianwealthsecrets.com. And under this episode, this is episode 70. So / episode 70, you will see Diane's show notes page, where you can contact Diane, some of the information that we're providing here, including this assessment link. So I think that'll be a great opportunity for people to get started on this journey. Before I ask our final question, which is where we can find you or where people can find you, I'm wondering, what would you say? I have a funny feeling I know the theme of what you're going to say, but when we talk about Canadian wealth secrets, your secret sauce in business, in wealth, in success in life, I'm wondering, what would you say is your Canadian wealth secret sauce of today's episode in this interview?
Hmm. Hmm. Well, I maybe I've repeated it, but my secret sauce is around getting the internal conversation in a positive state so that the interaction with people is in a positive state where you want it to go. And then for me, um, my what works for me is having a really, really clear sense of purpose. I've spent probably my whole life, I didn't realize it until recently, but I probably spent my whole life on this path of communication and getting that right. I have spent years practicing and failing and practicing some more and then learning and then helping others. And it really has been on this theme of helping people with communication. And the proof has been in that my own children are wonderful communicators and they connect from the heart. And many of my clients have said so and brought testimonials that you can see on my LinkedIn page. But that's what fuels me. Period.
I love it. I love it. And, something that I'm sure many of our listeners recognize when we called this podcast Canadian Wealth Secrets, the definition of wealth is for us so vast, right? Because again, wealth is not money, it's not assets necessarily that are monetary assets, but yet it's assets in life. And I feel like unless you have a solid understanding of your thinking, of your mindset, it's very difficult. You can have assets in all these other areas of your life, but if you don't have control of that asset, your brain, then I would argue, you're not going to have that full rich life that you're really after. So I think today's episode is going to certainly help many of us, continue to work on that path so that we can truly reach that level of a true wealthy life.
It's the asset we're born with, and it's the only one we take with us.
I love it. You are 100% correct. And I think that is such a great place to leave us. Where can the Canadian Wealth Secrets audience find out more about Diane Nelson and the work you're doing? I'm sure there will be some people who are looking to connect.
Well, I'm quite active on LinkedIn. That's the kind of the primary place. I'm often posting and connecting with people there. So that's Diane Nelson. And my website is www.thenelsonteam.com.
I love it. Diane, thank you so much for taking some time with us here today. It's been awesome. We're recording this on a Friday, so I'm wishing you the most wonderful Friday. And to those who are listening, you're probably listening on a Wednesday when these episodes drop. So enjoy that awesome listen. And hey, friends, let's start reflecting on those thoughts and let's make sure that we have full control of that mindset in our thinking. Thanks so much, Diane.
Thank you, Kyle.